Dear Boris Lozhkin, dear Jewish Confederation of Ukraine, dear friends, дорогие друзья, I'm David Harris, the CEO of American Jewish Committee, and it's my pleasure once again to speak to you at the Kiev Jewish Forum. I'm grateful for the invitation. But this time, unlike the previous occasions, I'd like to go in a slightly different direction. And the reason is really quite simple and straightforward. This will be my last opportunity to speak at the Kiev Jewish Forum in my current role at the American Jewish Committee. So allow me to look back and then to look ahead. In 1974, I first traveled to the Soviet Union on a U.S.-Soviet exchange program as a teacher. I spent several months in Moscow and Leningrad, and eventually I was expelled from the country. But that came only after I had met with Soviet Jews, many brave, courageous, heroic Soviet Jews in both cities who were determined to keep Jewish identity alive under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. 7 years later, I was able to return to the Soviet Union and for the first time visited Kiev. And during that visit to Kiev, again in those dark Soviet times, I was able as well to visit Babi Yar. At the time, as many of you know, the monument at Babi Yar had the words "K жертвам фашистов," to the victims of fascism, with no reference to the Jews, the tens of thousands of Jews murdered there. So when 1991 came around, those dramatic events, we at the American Jewish Committee and I personally took a very special interest in supporting the rebirth of independence in Ukraine. We publicly called on then President George H.W. Bush to do what he was reluctant to do and to extend American support for Ukrainian independence. We were proud when the United States did it. And from that day forward, 30 years now, we have been supportive of Ukraine's efforts not just to reestablish its independence, but to chart a path of peace, prosperity, security, stability, and open relations with those countries it wishes to. Of course, there have been obstacles. I remember in 1994 the signing of the Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine willingly gave up its own nuclear arsenal from Soviet days in exchange for guarantees from the four signatory countries that Ukraine's territorial independence and sovereignty would be guaranteed. Well, we saw what happened when that was later tested. Fast forward to the days of Maidan, 2014. Again, we at American Jewish Committee were strongly and openly supportive of the Ukrainian efforts to establish their own destiny and not to be bullied by neighbors. And that's why we appointed Dr. Sam Klieger of the HAC staff to travel to Kiev and to open our office as a gesture of solidarity and support for what was happening in Ukraine. I believe we were the only such organization in the world to do so. And together with Ukrainian American and other interested organizations in the United States, we pressed the Obama administration to be more supportive of Ukraine's need for defensive weapons. And most recently, I had the privilege of returning to Kiev, this time for the opening of the extraordinary new exhibits at Babi Yar. And this time, it's not just about references "K жертвам фашистов." This time, it's about appropriately, if belatedly, commemorating the tragedy that took place at Babi Yar. I know full well that the history of Ukraine with respect to Jews has often been a very difficult and complicated and painful one. And I also know full well that the journey of Ukraine from 1991 until today has also not been an easy or linear path. But I do know that things are headed in the right direction. I do know that Ukraine has witnessed the rebirth of an extraordinarily vibrant and important and large Jewish community. I do know that Ukraine has strong bilateral relations with Israel, and increasingly has shown in its voting record at the United Nations a willingness to express support for Israel, even when it may not be politically expedient to do so. I do know that Ukraine seeks closer relations both with the European Union and the United States. And I do know that Ukraine continues to wonder what happened to those guarantees in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Even though I will be leaving AJC, I hope that our organization will continue to be supportive of those core pillars and principles of Ukrainian rebirth, independence, prosperity, including an energized Jewish community. And I also know something else which I believe is important for all of us to remember. Going back again to those dark days of 1974 and 1981 and all the other years of that Soviet era, what's been accomplished is nothing short of remarkable. We, the Jewish people, must never lose sight that it was the Soviet intention to extinguish the last vestiges of Jewish identity on Soviet soil. And yet we witnessed in 1991 the last vestiges of Soviet power and the rebirth of Jewish life in Ukraine and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union. And Ukraine, as from having been an implacable foe of Israel in the Soviet days, has now become a friend and partner. History can move forward. And the example of the Jewish community of Ukraine, represented here by the Jewish Confederation and other institutions, should be a reminder, an inspiring reminder, of what's possible. We Jews say, Ani ma'amin, I believe. I believe from everything I've seen and learned from the experience of Ukraine and the Jewish community, that the Jewish future, whether in Ukraine, in Israel, here in the United States, or elsewhere, can be bright. Together, let's ensure that the best days of the Jewish people lie ahead of us. Goodbye, shalom, to svidanya from New York.